I grew up in northern Minnesota, where the cold settles into your bones long before December arrives. Our family farmhouse sat alone on 40 acres of white fields and black winterwoods. When I returned home for Christmas in 2014, I expected the silence, the isolation, and the endless frozen nights. What I did not expect was the sound of something walking on the roof above my bedroom. Something heavy enough to shake the rafters, yet leave no trace behind. It began 3 nights before Christmas. I was 19, home from my first semester of college, and trying to cram all my belongings into my childhood room. Snow hammered the roof, and wind rattled the window. I was mid-unpacking when a series of thudding steps moved across the ceiling. Not random settling, not the familiar thermal popping of old wood. These steps were evenly spaced, slow, and deliberate. I froze, listening. The steps stopped directly above the window. I waited for a second round, but the silence returned so completely it felt staged. The next morning, I told my father. He dismissed it immediately. "Houses talk," he said. "Snow shifts. Wind plays tricks." I let his explanation stand even though it felt like a weak excuse. Something about those steps had weight, intention. The second night, the steps returned. Same hour, same pacing. Only this time they seemed faster, more agitated. I stood below the ceiling again, tracking the movement. The roof trembled under each impact. I looked through the window, expecting to see some shape outlined against the moonlight, but nothing moved out there except loose snow drifting off the shingles. When the footsteps stopped, I left the lamp on until sunrise. Christmas Eve arrived, and with it came the worst storm of the season. Wind howled through the fields like an animal in pain. The sky smeared gray over everything. We ate dinner early, and by midnight my parents had gone to bed. I stayed downstairs by the fireplace, letting the warmth keep the darkness at bay. At 1:30, the lights flickered. Then the house went fully dark. Only the fire still glowed. The roof groaned, and the sound returned. Footsteps, heavier now, above the living room. I stood and shifted toward the center of the room. The pacing above me changed direction, following my path. Something on the roof was tracking my movements. I whispered for my father, but my voice felt swallowed by the storm. I stepped toward the hallway. Whatever was above me stepped in the same pattern. Its awareness was undeniable, its intent just as clear. Then the heating vent behind me exhaled a weak draft of cold air. Not wind, not settling. A whisper threaded through it, strained and breathy, as if someone pressed their mouth directly against the metal. I leaned closer against every instinct. The vent breathed 3 soft syllables. "Evan, let me." I stumbled backward, knocking a snow globe off the table. It shattered across the floor. The whispering stopped instantly. So did the footsteps on the roof. A dead, suffocating silence took their place. I bolted upstairs and shook my father awake. He grabbed a flashlight, threw on a coat, and we went outside into the storm. Snow whipped across the yard, stinging our faces. We circled the house. No footprints, no indentations near the walls, no signs that anything had climbed or walked across the roof. My father climbed the ladder and swept his flashlight across the shingles. Pristine snow, untouched. He climbed down slowly. I could tell he did not believe me, but also knew I believed what I heard. Inside, the house felt colder. The furnace kicked on, but failed to warm anything. The vents made occasional soft noises, but none resembled whispers. I stayed awake until dawn, listening for more steps, more breaths, anything. Nothing came. The next day was tense. We tried to pretend the night before never happened, but the silence felt unnatural, too controlled. My mother suggested hot chocolate and movies. My father avoided eye contact. Just before dusk, I stepped outside to bring in firewood. The air was colder than earlier, colder than it should have been. As I lifted the logs, a soft thud echoed from above. Not on the roof directly, more like something landing lightly on the upper eaves. I looked up. No movement, but the sense of being watched descended so suddenly it knotted my stomach. That night, I barely slept. At around 3:30, one final step landed above my room. Not pacing, not walking, just a single heavy step, followed by a long dragging sound sliding across the shingles, pulled toward the far end of the roof. Then silence thick enough to press against my ears. By morning, the roof was untouched again. We stayed through Christmas Day, but the house felt wrong. Empty but observed, quiet but expectant. Every vent in the house released small gusts of cold air at random intervals, like faint breaths. I returned to college on the 27th, grateful to leave. My parents sold the farmhouse the next spring. The new owners moved in during the fall. By January, they were gone, leaving most of their belongings behind. They gave no explanation. They simply left. For years afterward, I avoided winter cabins, attics, roofs, and heating vents. But the thing did not stay behind. Every Christmas Eve since 2014, at exactly 1:30 in the morning, wherever I am sleeping, a nearby vent releases a thin stream of cold air. Always cold. Always 3 syllables carried softly in the draft. Not words. Not exactly. But the cadence matches the farmhouse vent perfectly. I never leaned close enough to confirm. When I was 12, I discovered that Christmas Eve has 2 kinds of visitors. One brings gifts. The other brings silence, stillness, and a presence so unnatural that even the decorated houses on our street seemed to dim when he passed them. My parents still think the memories I describe are fragments of childhood imagination. I know better. Every December, no matter how far I move, something finds me at the same hour, with the same quiet persistence, wearing the same dark red coat. It began in Oregon, in a suburban cul-de-sac where everyone decorated their homes with bright lights and plastic reindeer. Christmas was always predictable. Family stayed inside. Kids went to bed early. The street emptied before 9. But in 2009, on Christmas Eve, I stayed awake in the living room hoping to see the first snow of the season. I kept switching between the window and the TV, restless and excited. There was no snow, only the faint hum of pine trees swaying beyond our fence. Then a figure appeared at the far end of the street, a man in a long red coat. At first, I thought it was someone dressed as Santa, maybe a neighbor being festive. But the coat was wrong. Too long, too heavy. It wasn't bright cherry red either. It was darker, almost brown red like dry blood. He walked slowly, each step too controlled, as if he were measuring the distance between every point on the pavement. He stopped at each driveway, stood perfectly still, then moved to the next without glancing around. The closer he came, the stranger his movements appeared. He didn't sway or shift his weight like normal people do. His posture was rigid, spine straight, arms unmoving beneath the coat. The hood covered his head entirely. I watched him through the window, the glow from our Christmas tree casting shifting colors across the glass. When he reached our house, he stopped at the mailbox and turned toward our living room window. I ducked behind the couch before he could see me. I held my breath, listening for any kind of movement. Nothing. Only the faint ticking of our wall clock. After a minute, I peeked above the cushions. He was gone. I told my parents, but they dismissed it immediately. They said it was probably someone heading home from a party. But the quietness in our neighborhood made that explanation feel hollow. The next morning, Christmas felt normal until my father checked the doorbell camera out of curiosity. The footage showed the man clearly. Tall, hood pulled low, coat swaying slightly in the wind. He stopped at our driveway, turned his hood toward the camera, and stood perfectly still. What disturbed us most was the darkness inside the hood. No face, no glint of eyes, just a void where features should have been. My father sent the footage to the police. They took a report, but never followed up. A year passed. Christmas returned, and so did he. On Christmas Eve 2010, at the same hour, the same figure walked into view from the end of the street. Same coat, same gait, But this time he behaved differently. He didn't pause at driveways. He approached windows. He leaned in. He pressed the hooded void where his face should have been flat against the glass of each home, one by one, as though he were listening or searching for something. When he reached my house, I felt an instinctive fear that I can't fully explain, like something primal waking up inside my chest. I hid under my bed as his shadow moved across my room. I could see it stretching under the gap between the wall and the mattress. He stayed there long enough for condensation to form on the outside of the window, shaped like the imprint of a hand. The next morning, we found footprints in the snow across our yard, but they were strange. The impressions were deepest at the toes and barely visible at the heels, as if he walked leaning impossibly forward. Police could not identify them. They came back with the same empty words they always used: seasonal prank, harmless passerby, misunderstanding. But the man kept returning. Every Christmas Eve from 2011 to 2016, he walked our street. He never changed pace. He never changed direction. He never interacted with anyone but me. I knew he saw me even when I hid. Every year he approached our house more directly, coming closer to the windows, staying longer at the door. When I turned 18, home from college for break, I decided to stay awake deliberately. It wasn't courage. It was inevitability. The fear had grown with me, maturing into something sharp and undeniable. At 11:45, I heard our front gate creak. I turned off all the lights in the house. The only illumination came from the distant street lamp bleeding through the blinds. I looked outside, and there he stood in our yard, not moving. The coat looked older now, heavier, soaked with frost like it had absorbed winter after winter. He tilted his head very slowly upward, as if he sensed my eyes on him. I dropped the blinds instantly, but I kept a thin gap open, just enough to see what he did next. He walked toward our front door. One step, another, and another. When he reached the door, he lifted one gloved hand and placed it flat against the wood. He stood perfectly still for several seconds, as if feeling the grain of the door. Then he knocked. 5 slow, faint knocks. I waited for my parents to react, but the knocks were too quiet for anyone else to hear. After the 5th knock, he lowered his hand and walked away. Not toward the street, toward the woods behind our neighborhood. He disappeared into the trees without turning back. When we finally moved 2 months later, I expected the terror to end. But the new owners sold the house after their first Christmas. A neighbor later told me she saw a man in a red coat standing in their yard at midnight. She said he whispered something repeatedly. She never told anyone what the words were. I now avoid windows every December. I never wear red. And every Christmas Eve, at exactly 11:30, my phone vibrates 5 times in a row. 5 silent notifications. 5 knocks. I never open them. My family owned a small, weathered cabin tucked into a fold of the Wyoming mountains. We had spent nearly every Christmas there since I was a child, hauling wood, stringing lights half-heartedly, and pretending the isolation was romantic. The truth was simpler. The cabin was cheap, private, and far from anyone who might judge us. On December 23rd of 2019, I arrived with the usual mix of relief and fatigue. Snow lay in heavy drifts. The sky was a flat, pale sheet. The place felt as it always had, functional and measured to the demands of cold. We stacked wood. We ate. We pretended the thin holiday cheer could be enough. The first night, I stepped outside to take a bag of trash down to the thicket behind the cabin. Trees pressed close together, their branches thick with frozen needles, and the world beyond them was a black wall. As I turned back toward the porch, I heard a sound, a faint chiming that might easily have been dismissed if I had not felt it move like a thought along the cold. When I paused, the sound stopped. When I moved again, it resumed. At first, I told myself it was wind caught in the metal tag of an old sled or a loose tin. Then it changed character and became something melodic. It was singing. The voice was small at first, as if carried across a great distance. It sounded like a choir filtered through long corridors of ice. The melody resembled a carol, Silent Night, but every phrase stretched and lingered, the notes hanging in the air longer than they should. I stood on the porch and listened until the sound retreated into the trees, leaving the night suddenly ordinary after the abnormality of its presence. The next night, the singing returned, closer and oddly purposeful. The tune was the same, but each harmonic had a thin metallic undertone that made the melody feel off-key in a way that set my teeth on edge. I trained a flashlight into the pines. The beam carved white paths through trunks and snow, but revealed nothing living. The instant my light touched the nearest trees, the music cut out, as if someone had closed a book. The silence that followed felt deliberate, like a pause waiting for a reply I'd expected but did not receive. When I mentioned it to my parents, they smiled and suggested hunters or late-night hikers. Their words were soothing and ordinary, and I wanted to let their calmness cover the gnawing in my chest. Still, that evening I woke to the sound again, nearer, a chorus rising and falling without any visible source. The notes did not tremble the way a human voice does. They arrived clean and in perfect alignment, like instruments tuned to a single unnatural pitch. I lay awake with the window, breathing cold at my face, thinking of choirs and fields and the oddness of a harmonic so precise in a place that bred chaos. On Christmas Eve, the singing began early, around 9. My parents had gone to bed. I walked to the edge of the back porch and peered into the tree-line. The song stopped when my flashlight swept the trunks. It did not fade gradually. It stopped instantly, a hard cut that felt like the closing of a lid. I moved the beam again, and nothing happened. The forest remained quiet and still, an absence that felt thicker than darkness and oddly watchful. At midnight, I wrapped myself in a coat and slipped out without a light. The cold grabbed my face, and the world seemed reduced to breath and bone. The choir resumed far off, but coherent enough to be terrifying. As I walked toward the trees, the voices rose and fell as if guiding me, then receding when I tried to approach. It felt like following a tide that did not belong to the sea, a force that suggested direction without offering safety. Then I saw them. They stood 3 rows in from the trees, aligned side by side in a formation that made my chest tighten. At first glance, they could have been people wrapped in heavy clothing, but the closer I came, the less human they appeared. They were tall, unnaturally proportioned, shoulders aligned with mathematical precision. Their bodies had no visible arms, and their heads were cow-like. When they turned, it was not like a human turn. Their heads pivoted in a single smooth motion, and the singing poured from them without any mouth opening. Each voice layered over the rest in a way that created new harmonics where tones should not have existed. Their feet did not make the kind of prints a human would. The snow around them was pressed into shallow, elongated ovals, too long and too even to be ordinary footprints. The impressions resembled depressions left by long, smooth objects placed into the snow and then removed. No lanterns, no discarded clothing, no signs of struggle existed nearby to explain how music that fit no human instrument could be produced by such forms. I stopped with the porch rail under my hands, holding the flashlight loosely at my side. For a sustained moment, they simply sang, the notes knitting together with a precision that made my head swim. The melody shifted into a minor progression I had never heard before, and it slid beneath the carol like ink under paper, changing its timbre. When that passage played, I felt pressure at the base of my skull, as if the music had teeth. A pressureless sensation moved through me, not quite pain, more like the awareness of an approaching requirement. They did not move toward me. They did not speak my name. They sang and occasionally tilted in perfect unison, as if the motion were part of a compositional gesture. The effect was like watching a clock demonstrate its tolerances, precise, indifferent, and unhurried. As the music rose, the air seemed to thicken and the small hairs on my arms bristled. When I took a step backward, Their harmony followed me for a few measures, then withdrew as if satisfied that the exchange had run its course for the moment. I retreated to the cabin and locked the doors, but sleep did not find me. The singing ebbed and swelled through the night, occasionally so near that the panes of glass vibrated faintly. When it was close, the sound carried a clarity that made the teeth ache. Harmonics nested inside harmonics in a way that suggested a design I could not parse. Sometimes a single voice would detach and whisper a phrase between notes. The whispers were not in any language I knew. They felt like the edges of words, impressions of meaning that left the mind unsettled rather than informed. On Christmas morning, my father insisted we leave early because a storm was forecast. I wanted to linger to look for tracks or a logical explanation for the sight and sound, but his insistence felt like an order I could not question. Before we left, curiosity dragged me to the window. At the edge of the tree line, 3 long, oval impressions sat like shallow graves in the fresh snow. I photographed them, though the images did not capture the oddness adequately. The depressions were too uniform and too smooth, as if something had been laid there with care rather than stepped into by chance. As we drove away, I glanced back and saw them. 3 slender dark silhouettes framed by trees, standing perfectly still at the edge of the wood. They did not move as we passed, and for a moment I felt observed by an intelligence that had waited for our schedule. The sight tightened something inside me and left an aftertaste like metal. We never returned to that cabin. My parents sold it in the spring. The new owners lasted 1 winter before leaving in a hurry. Later, a neighbor told my father she had seen the property at night and found a note wedged under the realtor's door reading, "They waited for me too." The realtor never explained more. Years have passed, and the memory of that choir remains like a scar. Sometimes when I stand near a stand of trees on a cold night, I listen. If I hear harmonies that do not belong to people, I stop moving. I do not shine a light. I do not call out. I learned the hard way that attention is a currency you cannot afford to spend lightly. The voices, when they return to my mind, are not pretty so much as precise. They fit together like keys in a lock, an arrangement you do not want to test. I do not tell this story often. When I do, people offer explanations. Owls, echoing carolers, the loneliness of a long night. Those answers are polite. They do not account for the uniformity of the impressions in the snow, or the way the music folded under itself like fabric, or the ache that the minor chord left behind. I tell this as a warning. If you hear singing among pines on a winter night, do not follow it, do not shine a light, and do not answer.